August 13, 1943, Charleston Navy Yard, South Carolina, 5:18 a.m. The rain had fallen all night. Not a storm, just the kind of slow, unrelenting drizzle that soaked everything without ever letting you realize how wet you were getting. A flickering street lamp buzzed above the gate shack, casting its orange light on a gaunt figure hunched under a wool blanket that had once been navy blue but now looked like it had soaked up half the soot of the city. The security guard, Petty Officer Gerald Red Mallory, thought the man was dead. He stepped closer, rain pattering off his poncho, and gave the figure a nudge with his boot. The man stirred, groaned, and slowly pulled back the corner of the blanket, revealing hollow cheeks, matted gray hair, and a pair of blue eyes that, despite the grime, had a sharpness to them that didn't belong on someone half alive in a gutter. "Sir, you can't stay here. This is federal property." The old man sat up slowly, wincing. "You still got DEs tied up at Pier 4. Mallory blinked. "Destroyer escorts, yeah. ASW school runs drills out of here twice a week. What's it to you?" The man fumbled under the blanket and pulled out a tattered spiral-bound notebook, the wire binding bent and rusted, the pages swollen with water and time. He flipped to the middle and pointed with a shaking finger. "They're aiming too low. The radar, it's bouncing off thermoclines. You're losing the subs under the shelf. You'll never spot M on the scope unless you—" He trailed off and looked up, eyes wild now. "Tilt the dish. Just a hair, 4 degrees, and boost the gain when the inversion layer dips. You'll catch their wakes before they dive." Mallory stared at him. "You were Navy." "Still am," the man said with a crooked grin. "Lieutenant James C. Warren, ASW Research and Development, or I was. They threw me out before I could finish this." He held the notebook like it was a holy relic. "I spent 6 months in the Pacific watching convoys disappear, watching men drown. I figured out why we're blind when the subs dive beneath the thermocline. This," he tapped the page, "this catches M just before they vanish." Mallory took a step back, hand resting on his sidearm. "All right, Lieutenant Warren, just stay put. I'll get someone." He turned and keyed his radio. What he didn't know, what nobody knew, was that buried in that ragged notebook were hand-sketched diagrams, equations written in the margins of grocery lists, and a set of crude but shockingly effective adjustments that would end up saving hundreds of American sailors before the year was out. And it all started with a homeless man at the gates of Charleston. The man in charge of base security that morning was Commander Doyle Hastings. A career officer who'd served aboard cruisers in the Atlantic, Hastings was the kind of man who didn't tolerate nonsense before coffee, especially from civilians. So when Mallory called in a vagrant claiming to have radar secrets, Hastings rolled his eyes and ordered him to be escorted off base. But Warren wasn't just another crank. When Mallory hesitated, Hastings demanded to see the notebook himself. He flipped it open expecting scribbles. What he found instead were detailed annotations of SCR 720 and CXAM-1 waveforms, overlays of subsurface thermal layers from convoy logs off Okinawa, and 3 pages that contained math so far beyond his own schooling that he had to summon the electronics officer to make sense of it. Lieutenant Brandon Ellis, a skinny, bespectacled MIT grad who rarely spoke unless asked, studied the pages for 20 minutes before finally whispering, "Sir, if this is legit, we've been aiming our radar wrong since 1942. The room went silent. Hastings sat down hard. "Get this man a uniform and a hot meal." 3 hours later, in the radar lab overlooking the shipyard, Warren stood at a drafting table, now wearing a borrowed officer's jacket and clean undershirt, steam rising from the coffee in his hand. He was drawing on blueprint vellum, the lines firm despite his shaking fingers. Ellis stood behind him, reading aloud from a convoy log. Convoy C-112. Contact lost off the coast of Guam. Weather, overcast, inversion layer at 180 meters. You think they slipped under it. Not think, knew. Warren didn't look up. You lose contact when the signal bounces off the top of the layer. Subdives under, you're blind. He made a few adjustments to the radar schematic, circled the feed gain with a red pencil. Now, tilt the antenna array 4 degrees upward, narrow beam width, boost gain by 12%, and recalibrate the signal processor to look for wake signatures, not the hull, just the surface turbulence. Ellis frowned, but nobody has ever used radar to spot a sub's wake. Warren nodded. That's why we're losing destroyers. It wasn't just theory. In the margins of his notebook were recordings, hand-noted echoes from live runs aboard the USS Oberender, where Warren had once served as a radar tech before an argument with his commanding officer over unauthorized waveform experiments had gotten him court-martialed and discharged. But now, suddenly, everyone wanted to hear what he had to say. By 3 p.m., a DE, the USS Fieberling, was ordered out of harbor with Ellis and Warren aboard. Warren strapped in behind the radar station, tweaked the settings, and waited. 3 hours into the patrol, the scope jumped. A faint blur, not a contact, just a ripple. But then it happened again, and again, each time fainter but steady. Ellis radioed it in. The sonar team swept the area. 4 minutes later, a contact, submerged, 110 feet down. Depth charges followed. Boil oil debris. Confirmed kill. Warren didn't smile. He didn't even blink. He just marked the time in his notebook as if he'd known all along. This trick's not new, he muttered. The ocean's been hiding things since the dawn of time. We just never tilted the mirror right. By midnight, word had reached Washington. And within 72 hours, the Navy began retrofitting radar systems on 28 destroyers with Warren's wake signature offset protocol. No official name. No patent. Just a ragged notebook, salvaged from a man who hadn't had a bed in 4 years. But behind the scenes, Warren wasn't done, because the notebook held more. Much more. And not all of it was welcomed by the establishment. It started as a curiosity. By the 3rd test run, it became a rumor. By the 5th confirmed submarine contact, each identified not by sonar, but by radar echoes of a wake on calm seas, the fleet started using a new name for the trick. Warren's glint. It sounded like superstition, like a ghost ship's reflection. But the officers who saw it knew better. It was a fleeting shimmer on the scope, just a shimmer. But if you turned fast enough and dropped fast enough, you'd find the hull still moving below, often before the Germans even realized they'd been found. No one knew how this was possible, but the notebook did. Warren stayed aboard the Fieberling for 2 more runs, then transferred to a radar analysis unit in Norfolk, where they gave him a cot, 2 hot meals a day, and unrestricted access to the test benches. He slept next to his notebook like it was a Bible. He didn't talk about the war much, not unless someone asked, but everyone knew he'd been in the Pacific, had served on destroyers, then been reassigned to shore duty. After a dispute over radar modifications, the Navy had deemed too experimental. They thought I was dangerous, he muttered once to Ellis over coffee. Not because I was wrong, but because I was right and didn't have rank. And yet here he was now, a civilian in borrowed khakis, turning the radar playbook upside down. The notebook grew heavier with each passing day, not in weight, but in consequence. 1 week in, Warren added new pages, annotations about reflected wakes under moonlight, not just in the microwave band but across visual recon. He noted that under certain weather conditions, a submerged sub created a distortion pattern on the ocean's surface, one invisible to the naked eye, but detectable with filtered polarizing lenses, and astonishingly, with modified radar that operated at dual frequencies. Ellis read it twice before daring to speak. "You're telling me we could scan for subs visually, using filtered optics and reflected skyglow?" Warren nodded. "It's not the sub you see. It's the way the ocean forgets how to ripple over it, like the water is lying." He wasn't poetic often, but when he was, it hit like a depth charge. By mid-September, the prototype glint filters were being installed on periscope mounts aboard 3 DEs. Warren wasn't on the ship that made the next contact, the USS Farquhar, but they called it in the moment it happened. Open water, no sonar, just a faint shimmer. The radar pinged, then fizzled. But the XO spotted a line on the sea running counter to the wind. They turned and dropped. One oil slick later, and Warren's glint was upgraded from rumor to doctrine. But not everyone was celebrating. At the Naval Research Lab in Washington, the sudden popularity of Warren's methods was making powerful men uncomfortable. Not because they didn't work, but because they hadn't come from within. Dr. Harlan Vess, head of experimental radar systems, called it folk science. He sent a memo to the Undersecretary of the Navy warning that unauthorized field improvisations risk destabilizing standardized equipment calibration. Warren read the memo, then laughed. "Tell him to standardize this," he said, and handed Ellis a new page from the notebook. It was a sketch of a U-boat wake cutting through a thermal inversion, overlaid with altitude-modulated radar beams, the signal strength forming a ripple pattern shaped like an eye. "I can spot them before they surface," he said, "when they're still on battery trying to creep up on a convoy." Ellis stared. "You mean blind?" "No," Warren said, "just a different kind of sight." On October 4, 1943, Admiral Jonas Ingram himself visited Norfolk to see the man everyone was whispering about. He found Warren in the workshop, sleeves rolled, chalk between his fingers, drawing waveforms on a blackboard. Ingram didn't speak at first, just watched. Then he stepped forward. "Son, they say you've pulled 4 boats off the bottom of the sea with a notebook and a coffee spoon." Warren turned. "They were hiding in plain sight. We were just listening when we should have been watching." Ingram smiled. "You ever think about coming back in?" Warren shook his head. "I already served. Now I'm just finishing what I started." He hesitated, then handed the Admiral a new page. It was an idea he hadn't shown anyone yet. A concept for a ship-mounted radar calibration module that auto-adjusted beam pitch based on atmospheric conditions. A box the size of a bread loaf that could be hardwired into any destroyer's existing radar set. "This isn't a fix, it's a foundation," Warren said. "Make every DEC like I do." Ingram scanned the page, then pocketed it. "You'll have your lab," he said. That lab came fast. Within 2 weeks, Warren had a private room, 3 assistants, and full access to the Norfolk radar bays. The only condition, keep working. He didn't stop. He mapped waveform harmonics against sea clutter, built a crude prototype of his pitch corrector, designed a new kind of signal amplifier from surplus aircraft parts that extended range detection by 22%. And still, every night, he wrote in the notebook. Sketches, equations, memories. Once Ellis peeked over his shoulder and saw an old convoy number scribbled beside a name. "Barker, Ensign, drowned. I heard him banging from the hull." Then nothing. The notebook wasn't just technical, it was haunted. In December, just days before Christmas, the Germans launched a desperate U-boat surge against Atlantic convoys. 37 submarines were spotted in 1 week, but only 19 made it home. Warren's calibration boxes had made it aboard 11 of the destroyers involved. The difference was obvious. Convoy UGS-27 survived without a single loss, thanks to 4 confirmed glint pics that sonar never saw. By now, the Navy had quietly printed an internal circular titled Surface Disruption Analysis Techniques for Radar Operators, but everyone on the line called it what it really was: the Notebook Doctrine. It didn't matter that the pages were stained, torn, sometimes barely legible. It didn't matter that Warren still lived in the lab, rarely slept, and had to be reminded to eat. His ideas were working. They were saving lives. But there was one thing no one saw coming. The page he never showed anyone. The one he kept folded between the cover and the first page. The one labeled only Echo Decoy Hypothesis. It began as a whisper in the South Atlantic. A destroyer escort off the coast of Brazil reported a radar return that mimicked a surfaced submarine, perfect echo, perfect wake, but no sonar, no visual contact. Then another report came from the Azores. Then one off Newfoundland. Warren heard, read the logs, sat in silence for a full day. Then he opened the notebook and began to write. The page he'd kept hidden was a theory that the Germans, knowing radar was beating them, had begun to experiment with false wakes, underwater noise makers, essentially propeller-driven devices that stirred surface water just enough to imitate a sub's movement. He'd drawn one once in the margins years ago, called it a wake box. The page had been a warning. Now it was a reality. And the Navy had no way to tell real from fake. But Warren did. That night he stayed up until dawn, listening to a recording from the Fieberling's latest run. Not sonar, radar logs. He found it. A faint rhythm, too regular, too clean. Real wakes, he'd once said, had personality. They were chaotic, shaped by the sea's mood. These were metronomes. The next morning, he presented his findings to the lab. They're baiting us. Decoys. Smarter, they've learned our pattern. They're feeding it back. He tapped the chalkboard. But I can filter it out. He walked them through it, a simple signal profile test, checking for harmonic variance in the backscatter. Real wakes shimmer, fake ones echo. He called it the blink test. It could be added to any DE's radar in under 10 minutes. By New Year's Eve, U-boat kills were up. False returns were down. And Warren, once a homeless outcast at the gates, was quietly being written into internal Navy memos as the man who changed the game. But he didn't care about that, because the last pages of the notebook were nearly full. And what he'd just written down would change more than radar. It would change the very way America understood the war at sea. The first time they realized the notebook had one last trick, it wasn't at sea. It was in the basement of a converted warehouse in Washington, D.C., where the Office of Naval Research had moved Warren's workshop, under the radar, so to speak. The official reasoning was proximity to intelligence analysts. The real reason, control. His ideas had outpaced the doctrine. The brass needed to keep a closer leash. But Warren didn't care. He had a soldering iron in one hand and a pencil in the other, and both were still dangerous. That winter, snow covered the capital like a shroud. Outside, civilians read headlines about victories in Italy. Inside, Warren stared at waveforms he'd drawn in charcoal on butcher paper taped to the wall. A Navy captain, seated nearby, tried to follow. So you're saying the Germans are mimicking our radar signals? Warren shook his head, not mimicking, reflecting, warping them back. He paced the room, the same way he used to pace a destroyer's deck. They figured out the glint trick. Maybe not how we did it, but they know we're reading the surface differently now. So they've begun using noise, electromagnetic, acoustic, maybe even surface float decoys to distort what we see. The captain leaned forward. Are we blind again? Warren didn't answer. He just walked to the far wall and peeled a page from the notebook, one of the oldest. The edges had nearly disintegrated. It showed 2 radar pulses overlaid, one normal, one twisted, not in power but in shape. They're not trying to hide, they're trying to make us chase ghosts. He tapped the paper. But if we change how we listen, not just how we transmit. He trailed off. Then, for the first time in weeks, he smiled. I can see through it. What came next was unlike anything in any Navy manual. Warren took apart a CXAM-1 radar set, rewired the pulse amplifier, tweaked the phase modulation timing, a technique no one outside MIT would dare attempt. He added a secondary crystal oscillator, something meant for sonar, and built a feedback circuit that let the radar signal analyze its own echo before it even hit the display. It's like teaching the radar to know when it's being lied to, he told Ellis. They called it the counter-deception pulse filter. Unofficially, the ghost catcher. It wasn't just theory. They installed it on the USS Janes, a battered DE returning from convoy duty with a broken sonar unit. Warren himself rode along, operating the radar from below deck. 3 nights in, off the Canary Islands, a signal came in perfect contact. Classic glint return, wide, clean wake. But Warren didn't react. He watched the signal distort itself, not in amplitude but in consistency. It's a loop, he said quietly, a fake. They ignored it. 5 minutes later, sonar swept the area and confirmed, nothing. If they dropped, it would have wasted charges or worse, given away their position. The notebook had saved them again. But the final test came on February 6, 1944. A Wolfpack attack, 7 U-boats coordinated. Convoy HX-278 was crossing the North Atlantic with a half-dozen DEs running cover. The Germans came at night, textbook conditions, fog, swell, intermittent sonar. But 3 of the DEs had Warren's ghost catchers. The rest didn't. The difference was brutal. The ships with the filter saw through every false wake, dodged every decoy, caught 2 U-boats red-handed. The others. 1 destroyer dropped all depth charges on a ghost contact. Another took a torpedo while chasing a shimmer that wasn't real. After dawn, the convoy reformed, shaken but intact. Warren stood on the Jane's deck, notebook tucked under his arm, watching the horizon. Ellis came up beside him. You're not going to publish any of this, are you? Warren didn't answer for a long time. Then, I didn't build this to be famous. He paused. I built it because they're still out there. Real subs, real men trying to kill ours, and we were blind. I just gave us back our eyes. Word spread quietly but fast. The Navy began producing ghost catcher modules in secret, under the guise of routine radar updates. By May, nearly a third of all Atlantic DEs had them. By June, that number doubled. Warren refused to be promoted, refused even to take a full commission. He remained a civilian advisor, living 2 blocks from the lab, still writing in the notebook. It was dog-eared now, patched with tape, smudged from grease. But inside were more than ideas. Inside were the names of every ship he'd served on, every crewmate he'd lost, every contact that vanished before sonar could catch it. And one last page, the only one he never showed anyone. It was blank. Until the day he quietly wrote, "There are no more ghosts." Then he closed it for good. But the notebook didn't disappear. In the final months of the war, it was passed between radar officers like contraband scripture. Operators made copies, sketches, notes. Even decades later, veterans of the North Atlantic could still recall Warren's glint or the ghost catcher filter, or the time their radar scope flickered and the XO muttered, "That's a false echo. Ignore it. Trust the notebook." Some called him a savant, others a madman. But those who met him knew better. He was a sailor who never came home, not really. He just stayed out there in the static, watching the sea for things the rest of us missed, and giving us back the sight we lost. Spring 1944, Operation Overlord loomed. In secret war rooms, maps were covered in strings and pins, but in Warren's cramped lab at the Navy Annex in Arlington, there were no maps. Just the notebook, the chalkboard, and a desk covered in soldered circuits and half-filled coffee mugs. His name wasn't on the planning memos. His face wouldn't be on any wall of heroes. But deep inside the machine that would soon carry hundreds of thousands of Americans across the English Channel, Warren's fingerprint was etched into every radar mount that mattered. The Ghost Catcher was now standard. The Glint Protocol was doctrine. And still he worked not out of ambition but out of compulsion. The sea had taken too much from him, and he was going to take something back. One morning, Lieutenant Ellis found Warren staring out the window at a rain-soaked courtyard, a page of the notebook open on the sill. "I'm close," Warren said. "To what?" "To making radar proactive, not just reactive. I've been thinking about how they run silent. Submarines. They cut engines, drift under layers. That's why sonar loses them. But radar, if tuned to the right frequency with the right angle, might not need the wake anymore." Ellis frowned. "How? You can't bounce off nothing." Warren turned, a thin smile on his lips. "No, but you can bounce off difference." That week he modified a Type 291 radar from a British destroyer, stripped it down, built a phased repeater coil, something no one had tried before in the field. The idea wasn't to detect mass or surface disruption, but to detect presence through absence, a subtle void in the reflected chaos of ocean clutter, where there should be noise but there was. He called it negative echo profiling. Ellis called it insane. But they tested it anyway. Off Cape Cod, aboard a modified PC boat, they ran drills against the Navy's own submarines. The radar scope looked like static, except in one spot, a patch that blinked clean. Warren pointed. "He's down there, not moving, probably battery running, dead quiet." They dropped a marker, radioed the sub. 10 minutes later, the sub surfaced, direct hit. The negative space had revealed it. Warren had found a way to see what wasn't supposed to be seen. By June, with D-Day underway, his methods were deployed across the channel. Convoy after convoy, destroyer after destroyer, equipped not just with better radar but smarter radar. His kind of radar. The notebook had become more than just a tool. It was legend. But the man behind it began to vanish. Warren had always been thin. Now he was pale, tired. Ellis noticed he stopped shaving, barely ate. When pressed, Warren waved it off. "I spent too long hungry to ever really stop feeling it." Then one evening, after 16 hours at the bench, he collapsed. The medics said it was exhaustion, malnutrition, a minor heart arrhythmia. He spent 2 days in the hospital. Ellis sat beside him, notebook in hand, reading aloud the things he didn't understand. On page 61, near a water stain, was a scribble. "None of this works without trust. The machine is nothing without the man who listens." Warren opened his eyes. "That was about sonar." Ellis looked up. "But it applies to radar too, doesn't it?" Warren nodded weakly. "Everything we build only works because someone believes the signal means something." He gestured to the window. "The ocean lies, all the time. You've got to decide when it's telling you the truth." He never went back to the lab full-time. They let him work from a small room nearby, with a desk, a bed, and a single radar set on a test loop. And every few days, someone would stop by with a problem. a new frequency to analyze, a false return they couldn't explain, a convoy route where signals kept vanishing. Warren always found something. The final thing he wrote in the notebook was in July 1944. It wasn't math, it wasn't a schematic. It was a note, barely legible. They finally stopped dying for nothing. The war marched on. In the Pacific, kamikazes began their final frenzy. In the Atlantic, the wolf packs thinned, their teeth dulled by endless detection. Warren received no medals, refused them all. He said he had everything he needed in the notebook. In late August, he simply disappeared from the base, gone before morning muster, no note. Just his cot, a cold mug of coffee, and the notebook placed deliberately on Ellis's desk, sealed in a cloth sleeve and wrapped with the drawstring from Warren's old Navy duffel. Inside the cover, scribbled in fading pencil, were 4 words. For the ones watching. No one saw him again. Some said he boarded a fishing trawler and vanished into the fog off Maine. Others claimed he was picked up by naval intelligence, buried in a black project no one could trace. But among radar men, the ones who had learned to see what others couldn't, his story remained gospel. In quiet bars from Norfolk to Pearl, they'd lean over beers and murmur things like, "You ever get that flicker off a COMC just before contact?" Or, "When sonar's dead and the scope shows nothing, wait one more sweep." And always, trust the glint. Ellis eventually retired a commander. He kept the notebook in a fireproof box, unopened for years. Then, in 1964, when he was asked to consult on a new submarine detection project using airborne radar, he pulled it out. Page 23, the first glint signature. Page 41, the ghost catcher circuit sketch. Page 77, the filter equation for wake suppression. None of it had aged. Some of it still hadn't been fully understood. Warren had written ahead of his time, maybe ahead of any time. And always in the margins were those names, shipmates, convoys, echoes from years when death moved just below the surface. The notebook now sits, anonymously, in a locked drawer in a radar lab on the East Coast. No plaque, no attribution. But sometimes a new technician will flip through it, marveling at the precision, the vision, the madness that dances between lines. And they'll ask who wrote this. The answer always whispered, always reverent. No one, it just showed up. They say the sea forgets everything. Ships sink, steel rust, bodies vanish, and the waves roll on undisturbed. But the truth is the ocean remembers. You just have to know where to look. And James C. Warren had known exactly where to look. Not just in the water, in the noise, in the voids between pulses, in the glint that wasn't supposed to be there. Even decades later, radar operators and Navy techs told stories that didn't make sense on paper. Stories like the convoy in 44 that swerved a full 20 degrees starboard in perfect weather, no contact reported, and 5 minutes later, a torpedo trail passed through where their lead ship would have been. Or the captain who trusted a flicker on a calm night and dropped depth charges on what command said was empty water, and pulled up 2 prisoners from a shattered U-boat with blood still dripping from their collars. There was no official manual that explained why, no line in the Navy's handbook that said trust the flicker. But those who'd seen Warren's diagrams or heard his voice on a scratchy training reel knew. They'd nod and say, "He found the ghosts, now they talk to us." By 1952, radar had evolved. Smaller, faster, more precise. But inside the locked cabinets of the Naval Surface Warfare Center, tucked between updated schematics and sonar calibration logs, there remained a strange document, hand-sketched diagrams in pencil, stained by water and grease. A signature in the corner read simply, LT J.C. Warren USN Ret. The question mark was his addition. Even then, no one knew what to call him. Official records listed no such retirement, no formal discharge, no burial. Some claimed he died at sea. Others said he walked off into the woods of Maryland with only a duffel and a compass and was never seen again. Ellis, now long retired and running a modest repair shop in New Hampshire, received one letter, postmarked from Alaska, with no return address. Inside was a single torn sheet of notebook paper. It read, "You were right, the echo was real." He never told anyone. Just folded it up and placed it inside the notebook, where page 78 had gone missing during the war. In 1967, when a Navy R&D officer working on airborne anti-submarine radar rediscovered Warren's glint principles buried in a declassified memo, he assumed it was a recent invention. Only later did someone hand him a grainy photo of a gaunt man in a borrowed officer's jacket, holding a cup of coffee and pointing to a radar screen aboard a DE off Charleston. The caption read, James C. Warren, Glint Doctrine Trial Run, 1943. The officer stared at the photo a long time. "He doesn't look like much," someone said behind him. The officer didn't respond, because what he saw wasn't the man. It was the notebook under his arm. Over the years, legends grew. Sailors began to whisper about the Watcher, a mythical figure who could see submarines through fog, steel, and silence. No one agreed on what ship he served on. Some said he appeared in dreams. Others swore they saw him once, hunched over a scope, vanishing when they turned their head. But always, the same phrase echoed across sonar bays and radar shacks. Trust the signal, not the sea. It became superstition. But buried underneath was real doctrine, the kind written in pencil, not ink. Doctrine that taught men to think, not just follow, to challenge what they saw, to find the pattern the ocean was trying to hide. In 1983, long after the Cold War had turned technology inward and satellites had replaced scopes, a young naval radar technician aboard the USS Elliott found herself staring at a strange return, a shimmer that didn't fit any profile. Too fast to be debris, too shallow for a whale, too irregular for current reflection. Protocol said ignore it. She didn't. She marked the position, logged the time, and hours later, a Soviet sub was discovered lurking just below the thermocline. When asked how she knew, she shrugged. There was a glint. The old XO smiled. Warren's trick. She blinked. Who? The XO walked away without answering. Today, there's no statue of James C. Warren. No ship bearing his name. No citation in textbooks or ribbons on walls. But in radar labs, his techniques are everywhere. In the line filters. In the harmonic profile arrays. In the way operators are trained not just to detect, but to suspect, to watch for what shouldn't be there. To read the ocean's tells. To feel the lie in the static. And sometimes in the loneliest shifts, they swear the old notebook still circulates, passed from hand to hand, station to station, annotated, worn, but alive. One tech, newly assigned to a destroyer, found a copy tucked inside the radar console drawer. No name, no label. Just 4 faded words. For the ones watching. It ends as it began, not with fanfare, not with medals, but with silence. And in that silence, something moves beneath the waves. Maybe it's a submarine. Maybe it's nothing. But if you watch closely, if the screen flickers just once more than it should, you'll know. He saw it first. And he left us the notebook.